I spent the better part of 2 months buried in Australian War Memorial archives, after-action reports from every RAR battalion that rotated through Phuoc Tuy Province, and declassified personnel management studies from both the U.S. Army and the Australian Defence Force. What drew me in was a single statistic that didn't make sense. The Australians fielded a tiny force, never more than about 8,000 troops at peak. And yet journalists who embedded with them kept using the same word, safest. The safest combat force in Vietnam. I couldn't reconcile that with the fact that these men were fighting the same enemy, in the same jungles, in the same war. Then I started looking at how they got there. Not what they did once they arrived, but how they were built before they ever set foot on Vietnamese soil. And that's when the real story opened up. Because the Australians did something that the United States Army, with all its resources and manpower, never even attempted. They sent men to war the way men are supposed to go to war. Together. It's April 1966, and a converted aircraft carrier, HMAS Sydney, nicknamed the Vung Tau Ferry, is cutting through the South China Sea with the first elements of the 1st Australian Task Force crammed into her holds. 5,000 men, 2 infantry battalions, 5th and 6th battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment, an artillery regiment, an SAS squadron, engineers, armor, signals, a self-contained brigade-sized force heading for a province most Americans had never heard of. What's different about these men isn't visible from the deck. It's not in their equipment, which in many cases was older than what the Americans carried. Some were still issued Owen guns from the Second World War. Their boots were inferior. Their helicopter support was a fraction of what a comparable U.S. unit could call upon. What was different was invisible, and it was everything. These men knew each other, not casually. Not the way you know someone you met at a replacement depot 3 days ago. They had trained together for months. They had sweated through the rain-soaked hills of Canungra, Queensland together. They had learned each other's breathing patterns on night patrol. They knew who panicked and who stayed calm. They knew, without looking, where the man beside them would be when the shooting started. What I found when I started pulling this thread stunned me. Because while the Australians were building units, the Americans were building a machine that consumed individuals. And the difference would cost tens of thousands of lives. When Australia committed ground forces to Vietnam, most American commanders didn't give the matter much thought. The initial deployment of one RAR in 1965, attached to the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade at Bien Hoa, was seen as a political gesture, a small Allied flag to add to the coalition. A token force, one U.S. staff officer reportedly called it. The Australians were appreciated, but not taken particularly seriously, as a fighting force that could teach America anything about modern warfare. The prevailing American wisdom at the time was industrial in its logic. General William Westmoreland's strategy of attrition demanded overwhelming manpower and firepower. The U.S. Army's massive draft machinery was producing hundreds of thousands of soldiers, training them individually, and shipping them to Vietnam one at a time through replacement depots, or repo depots, as the soldiers called them with undisguised contempt. Each man received his date of expected return from overseas, his deros, and from that moment forward, he was on a 365-day countdown. The boost of individual morale that this policy gave warranted and merited the one-year policy. General Harold K. Johnson, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, told interviewers. Soldiers need something to look forward to. Westmoreland called it politically impossible to do otherwise, and insisted the existing policy was good for morale. Reading through these reports and testimonies, I kept thinking, how could two Allied armies, fighting the same war, adopt personnel systems so fundamentally opposed to each other? The Americans saw manpower as an input, a flow of individual replacements feeding a machine. The Australians saw manpower as a structure, something you built and broke only at your peril. John Paul Vann, the legendary American advisor who understood the war better than most generals, summed up the U.S. approach with devastating clarity. The United States has not been in Vietnam for 9 years, but for 1 year, 9 times. The Australians were reading Vann's observations too. But they already knew the answer. They'd learned it decades earlier, in jungles far from Vietnam. To understand why Australia did things differently, you have to go back to 1942 and a place called Canungra. Nestled in the rain-soaked hills of southeast Queensland, the Jungle Training Centre was born out of catastrophe. The early campaigns in New Guinea, Kokoda, Buna, Gona, had revealed that Australian troops trained for desert warfare in the Middle East were fatally unprepared for jungle combat. Men were dying not just from Japanese bullets, but from disease, exhaustion, and the simple inability to function in terrain that swallowed conventional military doctrine whole. The Army's response was characteristically blunt. In November 1942, they established a training center at Canungra that would become, over the next 3 decades, one of the most feared and respected military schools in the world. By May 1943, there were 2,000 trainees organized into 8 training companies, with 500 soldiers graduating every week. The instructors were combat veterans, men who had survived the very jungles they were now teaching others to fight in. The commandant, Colonel A.B. Bandy MacDonald, had commanded the Darwin Mobile Force before the war. Every lesson was written in blood that was still wet. What made Canungra different from American jungle training was not just the terrain or the curriculum. It was the philosophy. From the beginning, Canungra trained units, not individuals. Companies went through together. Platoons learned to move as organisms, not collections of parts. When Colonel Ted Sarong took command of the center in 1955, he refined this approach further. Sarong, who would later command the first Australian advisors in Vietnam, brought in instructors with combat experience from World War II and the Malayan emergency. Lieutenant Colonel George Wharf, who had won a Military Cross in New Guinea and a Distinguished Service Order in Borneo, served as chief instructor. These were not theorists. These were men who had learned what worked in the jungle by surviving it. The Malayan emergency of 1948 to 1960 cemented the Australian approach. For over a decade, Australian battalions rotated through Malaya fighting communist insurgents in deep jungle. And they rotated as units. A battalion would train together at Canungra, deploy together to Malaya, fight together for its tour, and return together. The lessons from Malaya were fed directly back into Canungra's curriculum by instructors with current combat experience. It was a closed loop of institutional learning that the U.S. Army simply did not possess. By the time Vietnam escalated, the Australian Army had been refining unit-based jungle warfare training for over 20 years. When the government announced the deployment of the first Australian task force in March 1966, the machinery was already in place. Each battalion earmarked for Vietnam would spend months, typically 4 to 6 months, training together at their home base and then cycling through Canungra's grueling 3-week battle efficiency course as a formed subunit. Companies went through together. Every man in every section knew exactly who would be on his left and his right when they hit the jungle. I spent 6 months at JTC in the beginning of 1965. One veteran recalled. It was the best posting I ever had in Australia. I left there and went to Vietnam to join 1 RAR on the first tour, 65 to 66. The Americans, by contrast, were doing something radically different, and the consequences would prove devastating. The contrast between the two systems became impossible to ignore almost immediately. Second Lieutenant James McDonough arrived in South Vietnam in 1970 as a freshly minted West Point graduate. He choppered into his platoon's isolated defensive position near the village of Truong Lam as dusk fell. He found the man he was replacing lying on his stomach in a depression. They spent most of the night talking, neither venturing out of the bunker. The next morning, McDonough's predecessor was gone, rotated home. And McDonough was suddenly responsible for 30 lives in a combat zone he'd never seen before, leading men he'd never met. This was not an aberration. This was the system. The U.S. Army rotated soldiers through Vietnam on individual one-year tours. Officers spent a year in country, but only 6 months in troop command before rotating to a staff position, a policy designed to give more officers combat experience for career advancement. As authors Richard Gibriel and Paul Savage wrote in their searing 1978 study, Crisis in Command, command positions were valued not for producing effective fighting units, but as career tickets to be punched. David Hackworth, one of America's most decorated soldiers, called it the command musical chairs rotation policy. The result was a unit in constant disintegration. On any given day, an American infantry company contained men at every stage of their one-year tour. From the terrified FNG, a label whose profanity I'll spare you, but which stood for the new man's utter isolation, to the short-timer, counting down his final days and unwilling to take any risk that might prevent him from making it home. There was no shared beginning, no shared training, no collective identity. Just a random collection of individuals thrown together by the personnel machine. By 1968, with troop strength approaching 500,000, military psychiatrists were warning Congress that the individual replacement system was having catastrophic effects on unit cohesion. General Johnson reassured senators that the Army had no intention of altering the length of tour in Vietnam. Meanwhile, 30 miles southeast of Saigon, in Phuoc Tuy province, the Australians were demonstrating what the alternative looked like in combat. On August 18, 1966, barely 4 months after the first Australian task force had established itself at Nui Dat, D Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, walked into a rubber plantation near the village of Long Tan and collided with an enemy force of regimental strength. Approximately 108 Australians faced somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers. What happened next is the most famous engagement in Australian military history, and it happened precisely because of how these men had been prepared. D Company didn't collapse, didn't panic, didn't fragment into terrified individuals running for their lives. Under torrential monsoon rain, with ammunition running critically low, with 18 of their mates killed and 24 wounded, the platoons of D Company executed their drills. They maneuvered. They directed artillery with precision that stacked shells within 200 meters of their own positions. They held. Every man in that rubber plantation knew the men around him. They had trained together at Enagara Barracks in Brisbane. They had gone through Canungra together. Their section commanders knew which soldiers could be relied upon to hold a flank and which needed a steadying hand. That knowledge, bought with months of shared sweat, was the difference between survival and annihilation. At least 245 Viet Cong were killed. D Company held its ground until relief arrived. The battle had massive tactical implications, effectively allowing the Australians to establish dominance over the entire province. And it was won by a company of men who had arrived in Vietnam together and would leave together. One journalist embedded with Australian forces put it in terms that, when I first read them, made me stop cold. The Australian battalion has been described as the safest combat force in Vietnam. It is widely felt that the Australians have shown themselves able to give chase to the guerrillas without exposing themselves to the lethal ambushes that have claimed so many American dead. That safety was not luck. It was engineered. months before any of those men ever saw the jungle. As I mapped out the battalion rotations across the war, the pattern became unmistakable. All 9 battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment served in Vietnam at one time or another, rotating through on roughly 12-month tours. 5 RAR deployed in April 1966 was replaced by 7 RAR in April 1967. 6 RAR went home in July 1967, replaced by 2 RAR. 3 RAR arrived in December 1967. The system was methodical. One battalion would be preparing to deploy, deep in its training cycle at Canungra and its home base, while another was serving in Vietnam, and a third was recovering and reintegrating back in Australia. Crucially, individual reinforcements were used only to replace casualties. If a section lost men in a contact, replacements would be posted in from the reinforcement pipeline, joining the existing unit for the remainder of its tour. But the core of every battalion remained intact from training through deployment through return. A soldier didn't rotate home alone when his individual date came up. He went home with his mates. The 3-week battle efficiency course at Canungra was the capstone. Companies were put through increasingly demanding exercises in terrain deliberately chosen to replicate the Vietnamese jungle. Thick scrub, steep hills, watercourses, oppressive humidity. They conducted ambush drills, contact drills, patrol harbors, snap shooting. They built simulated Vietnamese villages to rehearse cordon and search operations. Every individual and every sub-unit was formally assessed for readiness before being cleared for active service. At the height of the Vietnam commitment, Canungra was processing 10,000 students annually across its 15,000-acre military training area. The training philosophy differed fundamentally from the American approach. Where American doctrine emphasized concentration of force, massive firepower, and rapid airmobile deployment of large formations, the Australians, drawing on decades of experience in Malaya and Borneo, concentrated on individual marksmanship, platoon independence, small-scale patrols, and ambushes. Australian patrols moved with agonizing slowness through the jungle. Journalists who accompanied them reported that patrols sometimes took 9 hours to cover a single mile of terrain, stopping every few steps to listen before proceeding. This wasn't timidity. It was supreme tactical discipline, drilled into men who had trained together long enough to move as a single organism. In a unit of strangers, that kind of patience is impossible. Someone panics, someone makes noise, someone doesn't understand the hand signals. In a unit that has trained together for months, silence becomes a shared language. The Viet Cong noticed. After the Battle of Long Tan, enemy forces in Phuoc Tuy province largely avoided major engagements with the Australians, shifting to mines, booby traps, and hit-and-run tactics. The one ATF minefield, an 11-kilometer barrier stretching from Dat Du to the coast, became a focus of operations, though it ultimately proved controversial when the VC began lifting the mines and using them against the Australians. The Americans noticed too, though institutional acknowledgement was slow. As early as 1965 to 66, when one RAR was attached to the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade, the differences in operational methods were glaringly apparent. The attachment had highlighted the tension between Australian economy of effort and American concentration of force. It was partly this experience that convinced both sides the Australians should operate independently, leading to the creation of one ATF with its own area of operations in Phuoc Tuy. What struck me most in the records was not the big battles, but the small ones. The hundreds of company-level patrols and ambushes that formed the real war in Phuoc Tuy province. In these actions, where success depended entirely on the men in the section knowing their drills, trusting their mates, and reacting instinctively to contact, The unit rotation system proved its worth again and again. Australian patrols achieved remarkable ammunition-to-casualty ratios, a measure of combat efficiency that researchers have studied in depth. Low ammunition expenditure producing high enemy casualties is the hallmark of a force that shoots deliberately and fights with disciplined precision, the product of intensive marksmanship training embedded in a cohesive unit. By 1968-69, the Australian system was at its peak. The 1st Australian Task Force had been reinforced to 3 infantry battalions, with a squadron of Centurion tanks, additional helicopters, and expanded artillery. All 9 RAR battalions had rotated through, each one trained to the same standard at Canungra, each one arriving as a formed unit with months of shared preparation behind it. The results, in the cold language of statistics, were extraordinary. Over the entire war, approximately 60,000 Australians served in Vietnam. Total Australian casualties were 523 killed and nearly 2,400 wounded. In Phuoc Tuy Province, Australian forces had effectively established government control through a patient, methodical approach. Company-level patrolling, cordon and search operations, civic action programs that never depended on the kind of massive, destructive search-and-destroy sweeps that characterized American operations elsewhere. During the 1968 Tet Offensive, when Communist forces launched simultaneous attacks across the country, one ATF was deployed to defend the critical Bien Hoa Long Binh complex near Saigon as part of Operation Coburg. In heavy fighting, 17 Australians were killed and 61 wounded, while Communist casualties included at least 145 killed. Later, at fire support bases Coral and Balmoral in May to June 1968, the Australians fought their largest and most sustained battle of the war against regular PAVN forces operating in battalion and regimental strength. They held. In each of these engagements, the battalions involved had arrived in Vietnam as formed units. They had not been cobbled together from individual replacements. Their officers had not rotated in 6 months earlier to punch a career ticket. Their NCOs knew their men. Their men knew each other. The contrast with the American experience, which by 1968-69 was spiraling into crisis, could not have been more stark. Fragging incidents against unpopular officers, combat refusals, collapsing morale, racial tensions, drug abuse. These pathologies, while having many causes, were profoundly exacerbated by a system that destroyed unit cohesion as a matter of policy. When men don't know or trust the strangers they're fighting beside, when their leaders rotate every 6 months, when every soldier is on a different personal countdown, the bonds that hold a fighting unit together simply cannot form. One thesis I found, studying the road to the My Lai massacre, put it in terms that still haunt me. The U.S. Army in Vietnam was destroyed by loss of institutional memory and lack of unit cohesion. The individual replacement system was identified as the key structural element undermining the cohesion of American forces. The Australians never experienced anything comparable, not because their soldiers were inherently superior, not because they didn't include conscripts. Roughly half of the men who served in Vietnam under the National Service Scheme were draftees. The difference was that those conscripts were integrated into their battalions months before deployment. By the time they reached Vietnam, they were not national servicemen awkwardly grafted onto a unit of strangers. They were members of a team that had bled together on the hills of Canungra. The Australian withdrawal from Vietnam effectively began in November 1970, when 8 RAR departed without being replaced. By early 1972, the combat forces were gone. The AATTV advisors, the longest-serving and most decorated Australian unit of the war, remained until December 1972. In total, around 60,000 Australians served. 523 never came home. The legacy of the formed unit system extends far beyond Vietnam. After the war, the U.S. Army, haunted by the cohesion crisis that had nearly broken it, launched the cohort experiment in 1981, an attempt to adopt unit-based manning. The program drew explicitly on the lessons of Vietnam, where the individual replacement system had been identified as a primary driver of declining combat performance. The experiment produced mixed results and was eventually modified. But the fact that it was attempted at all tells you everything about how deeply the failure of the individual system had scarred the American military. For the Australians, the lesson was never in doubt. They had known since Kokoda, since Malaya, since Borneo, that men who train together fight better, survive longer, and come home more whole, in body and in spirit. Canungra was the crucible that forged that knowledge into doctrine, and the battalion rotation system was the mechanism that delivered it to the battlefield. What researching this story taught me is something that no amount of technology or firepower can replace. The most sophisticated weapon system in any army's arsenal is trust. The trust that only comes from shared preparation, shared suffering, and shared purpose. The Australians didn't invent that idea, but in Vietnam, against one of the most determined enemies in modern military history, they proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. And they proved it the old-fashioned way, together.